Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session on disaster-related trauma, preparedness, response, recovery, and resilience. Today's webinar is sponsored by the ABA's Young Lawyers Division Disaster Legal Services Program and co-sponsored by the ABA Commission on Disability Rights and the ABA Standing Committee on Disaster Response and Preparedness. Thank you all for joining us today to kick off Disaster Preparedness Month. This session is being recorded if you'd like to access it again at a later date. My name is Linda Anderson Stanley, and I will be your moderator today. I am the Senior Manager of Disaster Programming at Equal Justice Works. I'm an adjunct professor at Stetson University College of Law, where I teach disaster law primer. And I'm the current chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Disaster Response and Preparedness and the special advisor to the Disaster Legal Services Program. I am a white woman in my mid-30s with long brown hair, and I use she, her pronouns. Joining me today is Stephanie Duke. Stephanie is an attorney at Disability Rights Texas, where she focuses on mitigating barriers that disaster survivors with disabilities face and remedying discriminatory practices. Stephanie is an Equal Justice Works Disaster Resilience Fellow alum and a vice director of the ABA YLD Disaster Legal Services Program. You want to say hello, Stephanie?
Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie Duke. I would go she, her. I'm a tall, slender, Caucasian, middle-aged female with short salt and pepper gray hair, and I'm coming to you from north of Houston, Texas.
Thanks, Stephanie. Also joining the panel today is Karen Koski-Miller, who serves as the lead for disaster mental health for the American Red Cross. Her role involves leading a cadre of over 2,500 licensed and retired disaster mental health volunteer professionals and developing training for Red Cross disaster mental health workers. You want to say hello, Karen?
Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Koski-Miller. I use she, her pronouns. I am a Caucasian, middle-aged woman with medium-length brown and highlighted hair. Nice to see everybody.
Thanks, Karen. And we also have Stefan Schulenberg. Stefan is the director of the University of Mississippi's Clinical Disaster Research Center and director of the university's interdisciplinary minor in disaster sciences. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology with a specialization in clinical disaster psychology. Want to say hello, Stefan?
Hello, everyone. I'm Stefan Schulenberg. I'm a 51-year-old white male, and he is just fine. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to have you all here today. We have a really well-rounded panel of experts here and have the opportunity to hear a really unique perspective from the academic and clinical side, the legal side, and the boots on the ground side of things. So what I'd like for us to do today is facilitate a discussion among the three of you. I have some questions based on what we've received in advance from the audience. So I will direct a question at one of you, and then we'll welcome the others to chime in as well so we can get the perspective from all three angles. I encourage the audience members to use the chat for discussion and resource sharing among yourselves. And if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function and we will get to them as we can. So with that, let's jump right in. I've lumped our questions into the three categories we said we'd touch on today: preparedness, response and recovery, and resilience. But first, let's set the stage a bit. And my first question is for Karen. Can you tell us a little bit on what is trauma and what's the difference between trauma and mental health impairment?
Okay, so trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. That event could be an accident. It could be someone who is victimized by a crime. It could be a family abuse situation, or it could be a natural or human-caused disaster. But the key with trauma is that this response overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. Now, the difference between trauma and mental health impairment is trauma is not necessarily in and of itself impairing, but it may cause unexpected reactions to particular triggers. The trauma in and of itself does not indicate a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's something that I find with the American Red Cross. It's often easy to say these clients in a shelter have PTSD because of what they've been through. Actually, what we're seeing, and I don't want to get into the weeds about the PTSD diagnosis, what we're seeing is an acute stressor, or an acute stress reaction. So PTSD has diagnostic criteria that I will not bore everyone with. So trauma in and of itself does not indicate the presence of a mental health diagnosis.
Thanks, Karen. Stefan, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I very much agree with what Karen just said, and I kind of think about things though maybe a little bit of a different wording or phrasing, and she's more involved in kind of the boots on the ground sort of thing, and I've been trained more in kind of an academic model, and so we see clients though here in our clinic. First and foremost, psychological trauma, I would conceptualize it as a set of ordinary responses to extraordinary circumstances or events. And certainly these can be very troubling for folks. They often don't really have a baseline for, what they're experiencing or the level that they're experiencing it. And I think there's a real danger in our profession in psychology, but also really just cross-culturally, and to pathologize things. We tend to want to label things, and psychological trauma can manifest in many different ways. We typically consider it as cognitive symptoms or experiences. These would be things like confusion or worry or trouble concentrating, a more emotional, like shock, panic, intrusive thoughts, behavioral. Lots of people experience sleep disturbance, problems expressing their feelings or controlling their feelings, tearfulness, jumpy, easily startled. Social, a lot of folks, tend to withdraw. A lot of folks tend to, to want to avoid and pull within themselves. And there are also folks that tend to respond in a more physiological kind of way, or that they kind of somaticize, these sorts of stressors. And so they'll have aches and pains and changes in appetite and fatigue and these sorts of things. And then lastly, one area that we tend to study quite a bit here at the University of Mississippi is more the spiritual aspects. And so for many people, very much can experience spiritual kinds of trauma or crises. And so a disaster or trauma very often will take people very close to their religious beliefs, their spiritual beliefs, their worldview. And people very often wonder, what happened? Why did it happen? Why me? Why us? Why our community? That sort of thing. And so these kinds of responses are very normal. And as a clinical person, typically what I worry about for folks would be is if these symptoms or experiences do not go away, if they're pervasive, if somebody is particularly distressed by them, if it's impairing their role at in work or school in some way, that sort of thing. So just a little bit to kind of open it up a little bit. Hopefully I didn't bore folks too much.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Stephanie, did you want to add anything from the legal side?
Yeah, just that, like Karen had mentioned, the impairment comes back to an actual diagnosis. And of course, from the disability perspective, especially from the legal perspective, that's when the legal protections do kick in. You've got to have the diagnosis, medical documentation, as well as that, it impacts that major life activity. So from the legal side, when you have that documented disability, that's when things kicks in. But with all that to say too, in providing direct services, usually when somebody comes to an attorney, there is some type of trauma that they are dealing with too. So you're going to hear a lot of me saying this today, is that we always need to meet the clients where they are. So.
Thank you so much. Stefan, I want to go back and pull out a little more when you were talking about the ways that trauma can manifest. So can trauma differ or manifest differently depending on the type of event?
Gosh, I certainly hate to say it depends, but it certainly depends on many different factors, and no two people are alike. You know, everyone has a unique set of internal strengths, or what we would call character strengths, resources. Everyone has the capacity for resilience, and humans generally are remarkably resilient in terms of their response. The vast majority of folks will be okay, psychologically speaking, post-disaster, but it may take certainly some time. But some people, you know, they may somaticize more, and some folks watching may be kind of familiar with that. You get stressed out about something and you feel more like nauseated, or, you know, just kind of sore and tired and that sort of thing. Some folks, it's more cognitive. A lot of times we suffer from this kind of should have, could have thinking. And I know we're going to get to preparedness in a little bit, you know, but it's that kind of idea. Well, I should have done something. If only I'd done something sooner, if only I did something differently. Those kinds of things, that kind of thinking can be very impairing. And some people are more prone, you know, or more, it's more of a habit, I would say, with some folks than others. But in general, no two disasters are alike. Every disaster occurs in its own socio-political, economic environment, you know, with different factors, and certainly risk factors affect people in various ways. And people have more resources, or what we'd say resilience, or perhaps more social support than others, and those kinds of things go a long way in you know, mitigating the psychological impact of disasters.
Thank you so much. So with that, yeah, let's turn and talk about preparedness, actually. And so I'll start with you, Stephanie. Tell us why we need to be prepared for disaster-related trauma.
Oh, well, unfortunately, because disasters are part of the reality in the world that we live in. I'm going to be a little Chicken Little, sky is falling right now. I'm going to throw some statistics at y'all, but disasters and emergencies, obviously, they're increasing with frequency and severity every year. And in recognizing the event, right, the disaster emergency itself, you have to understand that that event can impede, right, the capacity or function of a community. That's why we, you know, have all these things that happen to people. So it's understanding that the event can be a natural disaster. The event can be a man-made event, or even public health. I mean, right now we're under COVID declaration as well as monkeypox. But so some statistics. The National Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, put out a report just recently that talks about natural events. Since 1980, there have been 332 weather or climate emergencies that have cost over $2.2 trillion. And the number of disasters has increased fivefold in the last 50 years. This year alone, up until July of 2022, there have been 9 events, each event exceeding over $1 billion cost, economic cost. Man-made issues, cybersecurity. This is from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. There is a data breach or ransomware attack every 11 seconds. And of course, we saw that with the gas pipeline. And of course, that can impact infrastructure as well as put us at risk for breaches and personal identifying information that gets out there, identity theft and things like that. Other man-made things, when we have sustained power outages because of ineffective infrastructure. Texas saw it with Winter Storm Uri, and that our utilities haven't been weatherized. We have mass shootings that are increasing every year. extreme heat. We've seen it a lot more this summer, and there was a recent report that came out that talks about the extreme heat belt, that by 2030, we're going to see extreme temperatures of 125 degrees. And then we also have chemical and hazard waste, whether it's explosions or contaminations that also impact the community. Under public health, like I said, we've been in COVID for over 2 years now. And while the range of cost there is not known, but they're saying it's right now anywhere from 10 to $22 trillion. That's that COVID's going to cost us. Mentioned monkeypox. We also have the opioid crisis going on. And then another example is the water outages because of the flooding in Mississippi. But, you know, Jackson, that water system being inoperable also creates a public health emergency. So unfortunately, with all that being said, is in our world, it's not a matter of if anymore, it's a matter of when these events are going to happen. And we have to understand that these events impact the community lifelines that are needed to sustain a community functioning or capacity. And when that doesn't happen, people are going to need to have supports and services to follow on. And then we'll talk more about the preparedness piece in a minute too.
Thanks, Stephanie. Stefan, Karen, did you want to add anything to the why we should be prepared?
I think, and this is Karen, I think that obviously, and this is not a commercial for the American Red Cross, but preparedness helps both individuals and communities to be ready for these events. Let's, I'll use Louisiana as an example. Individuals who live in Louisiana, particularly in areas on the Gulf, recognize it's hurricane season. And so it is important to have what you need for yourself, for your families, whether that's medication, whether that's gas in your tank, any number of those things. The community preparedness is the bigger picture that I believe Stephanie touched on, where communities and individuals need to understand the resources available to them should these disasters occur. The one thing that I also think is important to mention here is the mass shootings that Stephanie mentioned. When we're looking at the range of responses that we might expect from individuals, there can be different responses based on natural disasters versus human-caused disasters. So, Stefan, did you want to jump in on that too?
Sure. From our perspective, we study a lot in our field and in our clinic here, the importance of preparedness. And some of it is just, it goes back to what both of you have said. There's no place, and I don't want to inspire fear and doom and gloom here either, but there's no place in the United States or really in the world that you can go that is not impacted by some type of disaster, class of disaster, or series of disasters. Every place in the US, for example, there are places that suffer from flooding and wildfires and extreme temperatures and just so many different things, tornadoes and hurricanes and rock slides and mudslides and all of these different aspects. We often talk about resilience and we often talk about it without really defining it. And so, we want people to be resilient in these kinds of circumstances, or certainly, on a recovery trajectory, a resilient recovery trajectory post-disaster. And one of the ways that we do that, and the idea here is really to stimulate people. Resilience basically means to bounce back and kind of to get back to where you were functioning, before the event occurred. But it's we know that preparedness is essential to stimulating people's resilience and giving people a sense of, what they can do when things occur. There are many different kinds of disasters and crises that are actually quite rapid, where you may only have a few seconds or a few minutes to make a decision. And it could mean the difference between, literally the difference between life and death as to whether or not you've given that any kind of thought. And so for one example would be a house fire. What's the quickest way out of your home? And people very often will think of the front door, but it might be the back door. It might be out the garage. It might be out, going out a window or something like that. And having a sense of that and what that would mean, or what our plan would be as a family, if something were to occur, that creates time when you absolutely need it. But even more importantly, it hardwires the brain, because the brain thinks in a much different way than it does, or when it's stressed than when it's calm, right? And so that's kind of the idea. We actually need to go through these things, in order to really train and really kind of acclimate and get used to, whatever it is that we need to do. The other thing is, and I always say the when as opposed to if. It's very definite, but one stat I have here for folks is, I work a lot with college students, and the average adult, by the time they get to, college age, 18 to 22 years old, 60 to 80% of them have already experienced an event that would be considered life-threatening. Trauma is like the number 5, PTSD, post-traumatic stress, is like the number 5 psychiatric diagnosis that's given in the United States. So it's omnipresent. We will encounter it, and if we have great familiarity with it, we will encounter it again. It's just the nature of the world that we live in. So preparedness, I think, is just essential for kind of having some sort of a template or roadmap moving forward.
Thank you. I think we can definitely all agree that preparedness is important. So let's talk a little bit about the how. And Karen, I want to start with you. Can you give some tips to folks on how they might prepare their clients or themselves for an impending disaster?
Sure. So the Red Cross does have lots of preparedness resources on the website redcross.org. So it's got a drop down with wildfires, hurricanes, earthquakes, that sort of thing. And that can be really as simple or as complex as someone might like to make it. But I think it's important to sit down with loved ones or whomever you're living with and just talk about, as Stefan mentioned, what is the best way and quickest way out of your house? Something like a go kit. It can be a book bag that's filled with medications, with some level of food items. It can be important papers, whether that's deed to a house or numbers of physicians, that sort of thing. Just having that available, readily available, does allow a sense of ownership. And, as Stefan said, it causes changes to the brain. But if you know that you have to evacuate your house, having something you can grab, what's in it, you take it with you and you leave. I think that's really important. And there are many, many resources. I actually looked for Go Kits on Amazon at one point, and they do have them as well. So I think that's really important. And if you're in an area, say California, where they're prone to wildfires, then there are resources available. And it is just super important to prepare, because it is a matter not of if, but when something will happen.
Stephanie, how about from the legal side of things?
I think Stefan and Karen both touched on, we all have an individual responsibility, right, to do what we can do to prepare ourselves, and acknowledging that and having those conversations, because even populations with specific or unique needs, if you're transportation dependent, healthcare dependent, power dependent, you have to be having these conversations with those providers as well, because like we're saying, it's not a matter of if now, it's when. So what are the plans going to be when it happens. From an emergency management standpoint, the local jurisdiction, like disasters start and end at the local level, right? So emergency management is delegated to the states for the safety, people and the property within its geographic boundary. But a lot of the time, especially if you have those unique needs, it's not necessarily planned for. So we also have to do a better job. I'm talking the collectively, right? And educating communities about the resources that are out there, or who to have these conversations with. Are we calling up our emergency management department to say, hey, I'm going to need X, Y, or Z. How are you going to provide it or help me do that? And when is that information going to be made available? So, and emergency management is a multifaceted, complex thing. They're supporting emergency support functions in different agencies, but we've got to have the right people at the table to have these conversations, as well as the community has to be aware of those resources and opportunities.
Did you want to add anything here, Stefan?
Sure. I would just add fairly quickly that there are many organizations that have like sheets, very easy to read, easy to kind of distribute sheets. The American Psychological Association has some at apa.org that's designed to help people prepare for a wide variety of disasters. I would also look to your state and county emergency management agencies. And so, for example, here in Mississippi, it's MEMA, and MEMA has a number of helpful forms, on their site. But there are other organizations too, like the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress has some, and SAMHSA and other related organizations. And so there's really good information out there that I think is designed to be easy to read, easy for people to process. I think the key is just getting people to think about it, and that it's worthwhile, worthwhile to spend some time on it.
Thank you. Stephanie, you talked a little bit about creating those partnerships and talking with folks in the community. So tell us what types of collaboration should be happening in the local jurisdictions to really address disaster behavioral health?
Well, from the legal side, we're trying to get involved in those disaster networks, those that actually provide response and recovery measures. At some states, unfortunately, with the number of events that happen, your public health might already have a disaster behavioral unit that is deployed. But it's being involved in those conversations beforehand in blue sky times to know that that is or isn't available. And if it's not, how can we bring it in? Or if American Red Cross is contracted to provide sheltering operations, what's going to be made available then? And then educating the community about that, because getting that information out after the event sometimes isn't going to happen. So again, it's that outreach and awareness beforehand that can be so critical to what the resources are going to be in the community.
Karen, did you want to add anything on American Red Cross side of collaboration?
Yes. So American Red Cross could not do it without partners. And so whether that's partners at the local level, whether that's working with FEMA and MEMA and others, it is, the American Red Cross will be there when there's a disaster. We will have shelters open. That will be widely communicated, available from calling 1-800-RED Cross, all of that. But I do believe that those partnerships that everyone has been speaking about are just so important.
Anything to add there, Stefan?
Probably too much. I warned y'all in advance. I tend to blather on and on. So from a mental health standpoint, a lot of it is really just sort of taking stock of what you have available to you in your community. What mental health professionals, for example, are available? Are there community mental health centers handy? I usually recommend contacting your state psychological association. Very often they have a disaster response network that they're developing. And so the idea would be for when something happens that they have some sense of like who is trained and who feels comfortable to go out and kind of be available. And so I think that's critically important, having good communication with various programs, knowing your Red Cross chapter, but there are many other agencies and entities that help. It's establishing relationships in your schools and in your churches and where people are. And that's the biggest thing, is getting to where people are and kind of developing that scaffolding in advance as best you can, because once the disaster happens, it's too late. It's too late.
So, Stefan, I want to stick with you for a second. Is there anything else we should be thinking about in the preparedness space to consider or keep in mind for those folks who have pre-existing mental health or behavioral conditions?
Yes, and I just want to make sure I kind of get to I have a few notes here. I just want to make sure I get. Disasters can create mental illness in people. They can also exacerbate existing symptoms. And the number one thing for me is just not really treating people any differently. And some of this goes back to the language that you might use to introduce somebody. You want to use person first language. Every human being, regardless of what they're dealing with, has a unique capacity for that resilience, that ability to respond in adaptive ways. And that's one of the things that we study. And in positive psychology, they do things like hope and gratitude and forgiveness and humor and curiosity and all these things that are character strengths. And regardless of what somebody is dealing with, they have these same muscles, if you will, that just needs to be practiced, or kind of worked with in that sense. One of the biggest things is making sure that you are, if you have the ability to do it, plugging in people with their positive social supports. And I normally don't like to kind of rank things, but if you're trying to help someone, social support is going to be the number one thing that you can do for anyone. And very often, if someone is dealing with a disability or a mental health diagnosis, that can be forgotten or just kind of glossed over or not given its due attention. We also look at other things like who are people used to talking to when they're troubled by something, and that may be friends or neighbors. Again, social support. It may be spiritual care providers. It's like developing a broad response there. And the biggest question that I have, and probably the biggest that I pose, and probably the biggest difficulty, I think, is something we all take for granted. Most people do not know how to make a referral, okay, either in the disaster context or even on the types of crises that people have on a day-to-day basis, or even in the longer term. So it's like, well, how, if you need a mental health professional, how do you make that decision? Or if you have a friend or loved one struggling, how do you, kind of recognize like, okay, I need a little bit more help here. I'm kind of beyond, I'm in over my head, that sort of a thing. So when do you make a referral? How do you do that? How do you do so in a way, because mental health, there's still that stigma around it. And there's a stigma with talking with people in the mental health fields. And I usually try to combat that and say, have you ever had a problem that was so big you needed to lean on someone else? That's like every human being walking around out there. And that's really what a therapist does. They help skill build and help people to, respond and tap into those, I think those capacities for strength and resilience and potential for growth. And some of the other things I have here, and again, I know I'm blathering, I apologize, but having a sense of like what are vulnerable groups, and so people with disabilities, mental illness, kids, the elderly, people, non-white people, okay? And so people who are not white are more likely to be marginalized, or most likely to not get the assistance or the resources that they need. And so it's having a basic understanding of, some of these risk factors, how people were impacted, whether they lost a loved one, loss of a pet, or they experiencing grief. And there's a growing literature on basically how to, kind of triage and work with folks, because there will, in a mass casualty event, there will never be enough mental health presence. It's just not going to happen. And so we need to train and educate people at a more community level to ensure that we have, the resources that would be most beneficial to people. End of blather. There you go.
No, that was great. Thank you. Stephanie, anything else on the legal side we should be thinking about preparedness wise?
Well, I think Stefan, touched on it that, our marginalized or underserved communities do not have the same resources, right? Their response and recovery looks a lot different from middle-aged white guy, right? So in preparedness, we have to be able to recognize community needs and plan for those needs to ensure those equitable response and recovery measures. And that only happens by truly understanding those demographics and those in your community and having those conversations. Again, bringing those people to the table in blue sky times, right? To plan and prepare and to identify the capacity of the community, and then tap into things that are already there that can help support, So, but it does come back to recognizing that not everybody has the same choices, right? So you have to deal with that beforehand to have choices and be able to respond in recovery or recover. And what that looks like for each individual and family is different depending on their circumstances.
We do have one question in the chat about preparedness that I'd like to ask you all before we move out of this section, and anyone can jump in here. So the question is, does planning alone result in hardwiring the brain, or do you have to train or practice?
I think it's incredibly helpful to train and to practice, to actually go through it and sort of think about that. It makes a huge difference when you think about like teaching kids in elementary school, like drills and that sort of thing, that they physically actually go through and do them. And there comes a point in their education where they don't really get those drills anymore. Certainly at the college level they don't, but they remember. And so that's a key, to it. It's like if you are, if you are being told that, oh, you have a life vest or you might need a life vest, you actually need to go and practice and put it on and see what it feels like and how you zip it up and sort of get a sense of that. And that's what your brain is doing, And so if you're thinking about, okay, I need to figure out with my family, here's the plan, here's how we're going to get out in case of a house fire or a tornado. I grab I grab my 5-year-old son, and my wife gets the good cat, and we grab the bad cat and that sort of thing. We're going into the, is it the closet better? Is there one bathroom that's better? In terms of kind of taking cover. Physically going through that just hardwires you for that. And just as another addition to that, it's one of my concerns about kind of the airplane spiel, the safety spiel that they give you, is that most people don't listen to it and feel like, I know how to fasten my seatbelt and that sort of a thing. But most people are used to pressing a button, like a car. Now, most of the, well, pretty much all, at least I've ever seen, seatbelts on an airplane, they latch, and they don't even all latch the same way. Some kind of latch this way and some kind of latch that way. And I can tell you, or somebody that, who works on an airplane can tell you, like, hey, this is what you need to do, to undo your seatbelt. But when you're under stress and there is the potential for panic and you haven't really thought about it, there's a great likelihood you'll reach for a button, even if you were kind of explained before that that's a latch. You might not even be able to get out of your own seat. And that, in my mind, is the difference between, mentally thinking about it and actually, hey, I need to walk through this, or I need to feel what it's like to, get up from my desk, or get up from, get out of bed and go outside and see what that feels like. You will, in all likelihood, have a greater sense of calm, a greater sense of what we call self-efficacy. You'll have a greater confidence in your ability to be proactive when something occurs.
As soon as you started answering the question, I thought of the airplane scenario. And now next time I am on a plane, I'm going to pay attention. So let's move into the response and recovery section. And I'm going to stick with you, Stefan, for this question. Can you tell us what integrated and inclusive mental health look like in the disaster recovery landscape?
Gosh, that is such a hard question. So, the preamble to that is mental health delivery in this country, like dissemination, how people get assistance when they need it. That whole system is broken. It does, the people who really need help the most get it. People don't necessarily know how to reach out for help, or again, have trouble kind of dealing with stigma, or just the lack of recognition that it takes tremendous courage to kind of reach out and say, hey, I need help with something. It's like, who do I talk to? Where do I go for that? From a broad or integrated perspective, it goes back to some of the things I mentioned earlier about what professionals do you have in your community? What can they do? What can they provide? How do you make a referral? There's State Psychological Association. Do they have their own disaster response network? In Mississippi, every square foot has a community mental health center that's assigned to it. And so at the very least, you can go and kind of say, well, I'm in Oxford, Mississippi. Well, what's the community mental health center that's assigned, to my area? And then, okay, maybe I need to give them a call and figure out, well, what can they do? What kind of services do they provide? I think there has to be a lot more education. I think there has to be a lot more collaboration. This is the superordinate task. And in psychology, we talk about that, that we need to know what people can do. We need to be able to kind of put our resources together. We need to make sure that, the right resources get to the people who need them, when they need them. And related to that, I have great concerns for the same reason, not just with, preparedness and kind of response, but the recovery piece. What happens when the Red Cross leaves, for example? What happens when the news cycle changes? Disasters like Katrina, people judge time by it. That was 2005, and people will say before Katrina it was like this, after Katrina it was like that. There are storms and disasters that can define a community, that are part of the tapestry of the community, the part of the community's culture. And so I think having a sense of understanding of that, trying to learn from each disaster, not being afraid to see where we have messed up, where we have dropped the ball, what agencies have dropped the ball. We need to figure out how we can, I always think of like scaffolding. It's like we need better scaffolding, and that comes through education, that comes through collaboration. It also comes in terms of flexibility and thinking, and not thinking that everything, and that seems to be in short supply these days.
Anything to add, Karen or Stephanie?
So I think Stefan has a great point, because yes, the Red Cross does come in, but we do leave. And so I can look to, for example, an operation that we are winding down now in Kentucky as a result of the flooding. And we've been there for, I don't even know how many weeks now, but we will be leaving. And with a response like that, we have very few disaster mental health responders or others in Kentucky. So we fly in, but we're only there for a finite period of time. Yes, we do have what we refer to as shelter resident transition teams who try to make those handoffs that are the clients get to choose what resources they might like to be, have us tie them in with. But resources are so limited that I think the collaboration piece is just so important. But Stefan made a good point about the community mental health centers. And from a disaster mental health perspective, we task our regions. We have 50 or 52 regions. And we task our regional disaster mental health leads with making those resource lists, so that when we fly people in, you're not starting just by Googling randomly to find resources in the area.
Did you have anything, Stephanie?
Ditto on both what Stefan and Karen's saying. It's the immediate response, like Red Cross, they come in, but yes, they do leave. So again, it comes back to that local community and those resources. Texas Girl here, Harvey was one of those events that was defined, right, the Gulf Coast. I still have clients right now that are waiting for recovery funds to come in to repair their homes. So, and the money's dried up, right? So everybody, all the organizations that got disaster funding because of the event, they're long gone. So those continued supports, you have to go back to what was already operable before the event. But again, if they weren't brought in to collaborate about how to provide this short and long term, it hasn't been set up. So, and especially dealing with the frustrations of long-term recovery. I mean, it's egregious, but that's a whole other webinar. But again, it comes back to having those collaborations, establishing those needs for immediate response, short or midterm, and then long-term recovery, and who's in charge of that, and then figuring out the resources you can plug into the community as well.
So thinking about those resources, Karen, I want to ask you, what resources are available immediately after the disaster? And then once those initial resources start to end, what are those wraparound services that are available?
Well, and sadly, part of this is going to be dependent upon where clients live, because the resources, I'll use myself as an example. I live in Maryland. I live northwest of Baltimore. We have lots of resources in Maryland. I know that, using Louisiana, because I feel like I have spent many of my past summers in Louisiana. And one of the things I noticed, to Stephanie's point, is flying into Louisiana when I did prior to, I believe it was Hurricane Ida, I saw blue tarps on roofs that were there from the previous year. So the resources that would immediately be available if the Red Cross is involved in a disaster response would be shelters, whether they're congregate shelters, so big gymnasiums or convention centers or things like that, or non-congregate, depending upon the resources that are available, which would be hotel rooms, which we were doing a lot during COVID. There would be feeding, there would be emergency distribution of supplies, there would be mental health professionals, spiritual care, health professionals on the ground, that sort of thing. And then generally we work with partners. Many people are familiar with World Central Kitchen. They are great feeding providers post-disaster. And then in the longer term, we do bring in, as I mentioned, shelter resident transition to do that sort of handoff and to help solution plans for individual clients based upon their articulated needs. And then when resources allow, and that is, when donations to the Red Cross permit, we do have long-term recovery grants that we can provide as well. So I'm feeling like I've left a lot out, but that's what immediately comes to mind.
That's great. Thank you. Stephanie, can you think of any others?
As far as wraparound services, again, yeah, that's just going to come back to what the local jurisdiction has, right? And they're planning for that transition, depending on the type of event. I mean, some may not be as long, but some response and recovery measures, like Kentucky's still going on after, 3 weeks or however long, has that been a month ago? Flooding, right? Which they're having to do. So it depends on the immediate response, the resources of the local community, and how that's all coordinated at the local level from your leadership and the resources that they have allocated for it too.
I'll also plug that an important resource after a disaster is legal services. So if we are in an area where there's a major disaster declaration from the president, then the ABA's Young Lawyers Division Disaster Legal Services Program is probably up and running and has a hotline available that disaster survivors can call in for free legal assistance. At Equal Justice Works, we also have disaster resilience fellows placed throughout the country, and also, of course, the local legal services organizations are typically responding to disaster survivors well beyond the immediate response as well. Stefan, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I think I would just reiterate, some of that depends on how badly the infrastructure is damaged, and not everything necessarily comes back or becomes available. Again, the effects of a disaster can last years or decades, and so kind of that idea, I think there is this sort of idea that, again, the news media moves on to a different disaster relief agencies have that kind of thinking as well. Very often we're kind of moving on to the next thing or the next disaster. And it goes back to, I think educating people on what resources that you have available to you from a mental health standpoint, knowing what mental health resources you have available to you, helping people learn how to make referrals. I'm a big fan of what's called psychological first aid and teaching people in the community psychological first aid. And that's basically how to help themselves under times of severe stress and how to help others under time of severe stress as well. I mean, there really is a lot more that we could be doing, whether from a preparedness standpoint or kind of a recovery, a long-term kind of recovery trajectory.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, one more question in the recovery phase. How can NGOs and VOADs improve their immediate responses to disasters for those with disabilities and disaster-related trauma?
This is Stephanie. So I think Stefan touched on it earlier, was, regardless, we need to meet people where they are, right? We can't assume based on an obvious disability or any other immutable characteristic, right, what someone may or may not need based on our perception, right? We need to truly listen and hear not just what we think they want or need, but what they do. So I think, our VOADs, our community-based organizations after disaster, these are the guys and entities that are there to muck and gut or clean up houses, that provide water, provide food or respite care or a shoulder to cry on for, disaster survivors. So understanding that, yes, there's, going to be trauma that everyone experiences, but even an underserved population or demographic, we may not totally understand. So ask, show some humility, but treat people as individuals and don't define them by something that may be obvious or not, and have those stereotypical assumptions. We need to recognize that everybody may need something different, and we need to treat everybody as individuals.
Thank you so much. Karen, did you have anything to add there?
One of the things that I should add is that the American Red Cross does have the ability to provide psychological first aid training to interested community groups. And so the best way to look into something like that, if you're interested or know of a group who might be, is to contact your local chapter. And we are able to do that course, psychological first aid. We're also able to do a course called Coping in Today's World, which is pieces of psychological first aid, but also developing resilience and some tips on that for non-clinical sorts.
Thanks so much, Karen. With the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our resilience section, and I'm going to start with you, Stephanie. Tell us, how can we reach, or at least start to try to reach, post-traumatic growth and resiliency?
This is Stephanie. I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, right? Preparedness, collaboration, but that's the theme. And as Stefan pointed out, resiliency is, the ability to effectively or efficiently respond or recover, right? But what does that look like after an event? To me, the ability to respond or recover is contingent upon the choices people have. And choices only come when you have prepared, right? So again, coming back to understanding the needs of yourself, your family, as local jurisdictions or entities, understanding the needs of the community and being able to plan for that, to stabilize those community lifelines that are a necessity to function and live, right, in our society. And from a legal perspective, we need to do a better job about awareness and outreach about all of these things, not just the legal services, but all the resources that are out there to help in that resiliency, because nothing is siloed, right? The legal response, housing, disaster behavioral health, whatever it may be, all of these things are going to play a part with each other to help with that response and recovery and build resiliency for the next time. So yes, we learn from every event. And we will never be 100% prepared for any one event, but we can do a better job to mitigate that harm and injury that we see beforehand. So again, back to that collaboration, back to having the right people at the table to have these conversations and figuring out how we can, pull people together.
Do you want to add any thoughts on building resiliency, Stefan?
How much time do we have left? This is our area of research. This is, I spent the last 20 years or so looking at this question, really. It's a fascinating one. And I saw in the chat earlier that there was a question about, or a comment on resiliency being bouncing back. And in psychology, that's how resilience is defined, is just the idea of getting people back to where they were. But there's also this concept of post-traumatic growth, which certainly has been, thought about for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and is now in the last 20, 30 years, has become a science in and of itself. And this is that basic idea of bouncing forward. So when people think about going through an experience and maybe they think that they're stronger, they feel like they're stronger in some way, they're wiser in some way. Maybe they learn something about their social network. And one thing I often tell people, it's a scary thing to not have people step up that you think are going to be there for you, but it's also essential to know that about kind of your social group, the people that are in kind of your, in your orbit. And there will be people who step up that will absolutely surprise you. and that gives you some pretty good clues about the kind of relationships that you really want to develop, how you want to spend your time moving forward. There's nothing like a disaster to make people feel insignificant and worthless, powerless, helpless. And so in large part, what we want to do is help people, to have that sense of self-efficacy. And more importantly, the concept that we study is called meaning, which is broken down into 3 different kinds of terms, really. And so meaning is this kind of idea of coherence. We have an understanding of how the world works. Okay, meaning is also significance. We want to know that we matter. We want to be somebody to someone. We want to be important to someone or some cause, right? And then there is also purpose, the idea of, do I understand or feel like my life has some direction, that's consistent with my values? Am I doing what I think that I should be doing? And there's about 60 years of research that reveals that this idea of meaning is essential to human health and well-being. It's related to just about any positive concept you can think of, as far as elevating resilience or safe behaviors or preparedness behaviors. And by the same token, it's one of those things that insulates. We know that meaning insulates people against post-traumatic stress. It insulates people. People are better able to deal with stress, anxiety. People are better able to respond, in substance use interventions, or have better prognosis for spinal cord injury or cancer and that sort of a thing. We're fascinated by that concept in relation to disasters. So you look at what people's worldview is and how they explain, what happens in the world. And a simple example would be, this idea of the just world hypothesis, which is a lot of people have this idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And that's one way that they try to explain things. Okay, well, good things happen to bad people all the time. Bad things happen to good people all the time. When that occurs, how do you make some sense of that? And so from a recovery standpoint, we look at meaning, because how people's worldviews are challenged and how they, whether or not their worldviews are kind of stretched, or sometimes we would say shattered, by what they've experienced, will go a long way in terms of whether and how they recover from that. In other words, how do they make sense of the, why did this happen? How did this happen? Why me? This wasn't supposed to happen, kind of thing. And a lot of people very much struggle with that. And the reality is, which you would never say to anybody, but the reality is, why not you? If there's a 1 in a million chance of something happening in the US, then that means it's happening to 400 people right now. So statistically speaking, things are going to happen. And so we try to help people, kind of put those pieces back together. And so from a preparedness standpoint, people who have a greater sense of what their lives are, what their goals are, what they want to do, where they want to go, they will be more resilient. There will be more psychological mitigation. They're much more likely to be on a resilience or recovery, or I would say a post-traumatic growth trajectory. So there's like 20 years of, just a summary of like 20 years of research or so. I'd love to talk with you all about it more anytime. So I will mute myself and be quiet.
Thank you so much. Maybe we should have a separate follow-up webinar just on this. But Karen, any thoughts on building resiliency?
Yes, and I think both Stephanie and Stefan will agree with me. Resiliency is important. It is, and many, if not most people are resilient. But the thing to really recognize too, and I think, if you think about the things you've gone through, and I'll, speak for myself, when things have happened, I know that I'm likely to get through them. I know that. But in a particular moment, I may not be ready to focus on my strengths. So allowing individuals to get there, certainly giving them the appropriate pushes at the appropriate time to remind them of their strengths, but also not neglecting to listen to the stories that they're choosing to tell you. I think that's so, so important because sure, I know I'm going to get through whatever thing, but right now, maybe I don't feel like thinking about that. Right now, maybe I just need to cry or scream or whatever, as long as it's not danger to self or others. So just recognizing that people have individual differences and readiness is not universal. So that's all I would say.
That's a great point. Thank you, Karen. Stefan, I want to come back to you in kind of recognizing the reality of our current world. What other events or threats should we be talking about here that we're not? Can folks perhaps experience this type of trauma from things like cybersecurity threats or misinformation, for example?
Well, in our research, I can talk a little bit more about natural disasters, technological disasters, and we've also expanded to study active shooter and active shooter scenarios. I don't know as much about kind of from a cyber threat, although certainly that's a different kind of anxiety, potentially a different impact, a different kind of threat. But in terms of what I think we need to be talking about is something that and I've basically struggled with this, and at the risk of offending some folks, we need to learn from COVID, and we need to go back and we need to take a look at it and kind of figure out, what are we doing as a culture when we're disregarding the people who have been studying, scientifically studying certain things for decades, for their entire careers. The fact that you can go to so many different places and get poor information or disinformation is very problematic. The fact that folks get kind of stuck hearing the same kind of feedback, that our cell phones are programmed to kind of feed us the information that keeps us on it, and so it gets very difficult to get any kind of good information or competing information. And we're not really doing a good job, I think, in education of teaching people how to evaluate that and how to basically how to think critically about it. It should scare, I think, just about everyone in the US, that what was this kind of versus science kind of thing? Why couldn't we get any kind of a consensus going? Okay, the nature of science is to gather information and then to develop hypotheses, come up with best practices, and then to learn and adapt, and then to incorporate and grow from that. But why are we getting to this sense? Why is it becoming so political in the sense of this kind of rigidity? This kind of extremism on both ends, right? Because it's always going to be somewhere in the middle. So that worries me a lot. That you're getting, depending on where you go, you get different bits of information, and we're not really questioning it or authenticating any kind of information that we're getting. We need to find some way of getting a uniform message, getting some continuity, and I think some synergy, between our science and our politics. So there, and basically that's kind of the thing. It's like when we're arguing about things, when we're trying to figure out if we're being too rigid, we're going back and forth on things, people are dying. People are getting sick and they're dying when these things are happening. And I think that's easy to, it's too easy to forget. It's too easy to get caught up in ego. And
yeah. Stephanie, is there anything else we should be thinking about?
No, I think Stefan touched on, especially with COVID, I think we saw with social media and the ease of information, good and bad, right? And obviously from the legal perspective, yes, you have First Amendment rights and all that kind of stuff. But I think as community organizations, right, when you establish a footprint somewhere, are you that vetted resource? Are you providing the right information to the community so they can make informed decisions? And, in that continued education, it's not just having a partnership, but a sustained partnership. So that way people know that they can come to you as a trusted resource, and getting that right vetted information out there to people. You know, you can only do so much, right? But I think we need to do a better job of educating the community about those different aspects too.
Thank you. Karen, anything to add here?
I think that Stephanie and Stefan said most of what I would have said, though perhaps not in the same way. The one thing that I would say from the Red Cross perspective is everyone is welcome in our shelters. And that comes with, so that has to do with whether someone is legally in this country, has to do with whether on the COVID, whether they're vaccinated, whether they're masked, whether they're not. And so I do think that it's a struggle, because I'll go back to our Kentucky response. We've had lots of COVID cases, both among the clients and the workforce. And so we have to be very careful if we have law enforcement in our shelters, which typically we don't allow. We then see individuals who become uncomfortable in our shelters. So the importance of trusted sources of information, with the recognition that now more than ever, there aren't necessarily those trusted sources of information that everybody trusts. So I think that's,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Before I move to the last question I have for you all, I wanted to go to a question in the chat from the audience, and anyone can jump in, but seeing the subject, I'm thinking maybe you, Stefan. We're talking about psychological first aid here, and our question says, many people freeze up and do not even know what to do at first. Is this the type of thing to be addressed by psychological first aid, or is that too much on the surface? Is there more to it?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think there's a lot to it. I think for the aspect of freeze, you know, this kind of, we say fight or flight, but now it's kind of fight or flight or freeze, you know, kind of a response. And that's what the preparedness idea, that's what going through and kind of thinking about things, that's what will give you that ability to kind of move, you know, when you really need to move. The majority of people will kind of pause for a second until they're figuring out kind of like what's going on. You know, and a smaller percentage will struggle with something like panic. There'll be a smaller percentage that is more like an automatic response, and very often that's related to, you know, some aspect of you know, preparation. And so going back to the airplane example, a lot of people don't know, you know, that if there's a problem on an airplane, if there's a fire, very often you can't see anything because the plane fills up with smoke. And some of the worst plane fires that have ever occurred, you know, folks had maybe 15 seconds to get out, you know, once things were on fire, and a lot of people couldn't see, smoke fills everything. And so even something as simple as using your fingers and counting the number of seats, you know, between your seat and like the exit, you know, those kinds of things, doing that's something that can help you get moving when you're really, you know, you may only have a few seconds to make whatever decision that would save your life or the lives of your loved ones. Preparedness will help you with that, and use that time to the best that you can. Psychological first aid is, I specialize in a very specific model. I do teach the Red Cross version. I'm versed in the National Center for PTSD version. The World Health Organization has a version. I'm versed in a model, and we teach one here called community-based psychological first aid, or CBPFA. And the idea is to work with people on skill building with regard to, how do you listen to someone? You know, when somebody is talking with you about a difficulty they're having, how do you listen, like with presence, in a very active, interactive, you know, kind of a way? it's a pretty important skill that a lot of people, need practice in. It's like, what are appropriate things to say to people? What are inappropriate things, to say to people? A lot of times, people feel the need to kind of fill the space if there's silence, that sort of thing. And I promise you, one of the most important things you can do if someone is struggling and you're with them is being there, fully present with them in the moment, sharing that burden with them. You don't necessarily have to say anything. And that's what Psych First Aid kind of focuses on, is kind of like, well, what can I say here that can be kind of helpful, as far and putting things together. And a lot of it is very practical. If you're making sure folks get food, they get water, they get shelter, they get social support, you're doing a tremendous amount for their psychological health. But one of the things I like a lot about CBPFA is the fact that it's designed for disasters, but it's also designed for everyday circumstances. So it's like, what do you do if you have a loved one that comes up to you and says that they're thinking about hurting themselves? How do you deal with that? What do you say? Can you be most supportive? And that's what psychological first aid focuses on. And I'm very biased. I think we need to be teaching that as much as we can, making it available to everybody. We need to be teaching that in our schools, our communities. And we need to learn if these things are going to happen. You want resilient communities, that's how you do it. So there you go.
I am never going to get on a plane without counting the seats to the exit now. So and there's a lot of preparedness I'm going to be doing on planes now, thanks to you. Okay, I'd like to move to our last question, which I'm going to start with you, Karen, but we'll go around. And I would just love for you all to tell the audience any resources that are available or tips that you have for staff or people who are working with disaster survivors but have experienced the trauma of that disaster themselves.
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is don't put yourself in the role of trying to believe that you need to be everything to everyone. We'll go back to the whole plane thing. You're supposed to put on your mask before you put on someone else's. And so recognize that it's hearing stories from survivors, particularly if you've been through in a disaster impacted community yourself, there's vicarious traumatization. So recognize that you can't be a hero. You need to take breaks. Self-care is so important. And there's not one universal thing for self-care. People who know me know that, one of the things they talk about with self-care is do yoga, do deep breathing. Well, for me, and this is not a criticism of yoga stresses me out, because if I'm counting my breaths and doing all of that, I'm so focused on I'm doing this wrong, that it just doesn't work for me. So recognizing that self-care, it's worth making a list of what calms you, because it's not a one size fits all. The other thing is taking appropriate breaks, reaching out to trusted supporters, whether that's a close friend, a family member. We partner with the Disaster Distress Helpline, and that's through SAMHSA, and that is a network of crisis counselors, and they, anyone can call the Disaster Distress Helpline, and their number, I believe, I'm going from the top of my head, is 800-985-5990. They are also able to provide appropriate support, but also make referrals if someone is in need of additional help. But I think the most important thing is trying to eat well, whatever that looks like for you, sleep as much as you can, and on a disaster response or with traumatized individuals, it's not going to be the 8 hours a night sort of thing. But just recognizing your own limits, your own strengths, but also your own limits.
Stefan, what tips do you have for folks?
I would agree with everything that Karen just said. And, I think one of the things I kind of point back to, models of psychological first aid, that's always like a huge component of it, is that importance of self-care. And it's essential. You have to take care of yourself and make sure that you're okay. Otherwise, you can't, you're not in a position to help everyone else. I love the analogy, like the cabin pressure. Sorry to go back to the plane again, but the cabin pressure and the mask dropping, they tell you, put it on yourself first before you help anybody else. But they don't tell you, that you have about 10 seconds before you lose consciousness in that sort of a situation. You're probably not going to die, okay? But you won't be able to do anything for anyone, if you lose consciousness in that kind of circumstance. And so a lot of it is, I just encourage people, take care of yourselves. Don't feel badly about it. It's essential. You're a human being. You do need to take breaks. You need to take care of your stress. And, I guess I'll kind of end here with, there's a quote that I find to be very inspirational and very helpful at these kinds of times. And this is from Arthur Ashe, who is a great humanitarian and a professional tennis player for many years. And he would say, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. I think that's pretty fitting, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to wrap up. And speaking of breaks, giving everyone a little break. Unfortunately, we lost Stephanie's connection and she wasn't able to rejoin us, but thank you so much to Karen, Stefan, and Stephanie for your discussion with us today and your insights. It was really, really informative for me, so I'm sure really helpful for others as well. And like I said, this will be recorded, so folks who weren't able to attend can watch this later on. So thank you everyone for joining us and have a great day.